Today we are with Tom O'Loughlin, who is the Professor Emeritus of Historical Theology at the University of Nottingham. Tom, in 1872, a year before the Didache is rediscovered, what do we know about the Didache?
We had known from writings in the 4th century, a reference by a Latin writer called Jerome and a Greek writer called Didymus the Blind, that there had been a text wandering around in the early church called the Didache. And it was assumed that, like so many of the early texts, it had just disappeared, and no one ever thought they could find it. There's a long list of such texts where we know X wrote on Y. Sometimes there's other works by X, and sometimes there were works with no name, and we thought maybe that's Y. But for the Didache, we just assumed it's gone, it'll never be found, and people just didn't think about it. They made a very simple assumption. All the earliest texts were actually the ones that had survived, and indeed the ones that had survived as the canonical New Testament.
Before we talk about the discovery of the Didache, could we say something about the discoverer, Philotheos Briennios?
Philotheos Briennios grew up just outside Constantinople, now Istanbul, and as a young boy showed great academic skill, and so got a series of people who not only paid for him to go to school, but they paid for him to go through seminary, and he became a priest of the the great patriarchal church in Constantinople. And he showed such skill, he was sent to Germany to study. And in Germany, he was taught the new critical methods for dealing with early documents. So when he returned to Constantinople as a librarian, he was one of the very few people who was trained to keep his eye open for anything unusual.
When you say new critical methods, what are you referring to here?
In the early 19th century, there was a revolution in German scholarship in terms of how you do history. And history would be done by getting documents, often referred to as the monuments of antiquity, and by carefully studying these documents on the assumption that a document tells you about its own time rather than about an earlier time or a later time, you would try to construct the world in which that document was created. And once you had created that world, which is a scholarly guess, you would then be able to understand the document properly. Now, that is a way of reading a document that's more akin to Sherlock Holmes's method than just someone who reads novel after novel after novel. And we forget that modern historical scholarship only began in Germany in the early 19th century. In that method that Philotheos Briennios had been introduced, and in which he was a very highly skilled person.
Okay, and that helps him when he comes upon the Didache.
So many people, the manuscript in which he found the Didache, which was a manuscript that was written in the 11th century, had been studied by many people. In fact, it had been referenced in many standard editions. The funny thing is, people said, I'm looking for an edition of this, and they went to the manuscript, copied out the piece they wanted, and forgot about the rest of it. But Brienios, with this new approach, he goes and he looks at the manuscript from beginning to end. And he's aware there may be surprises. He's not looking for confirmation of what he already knows, another witness to the tradition, to use the jargon. He's saying, hey, this is a manuscript. It gives you the date at the end of the manuscript, it's 11th century, and I'm going to see what this manuscript can tell me. So he, in a way, can deliberately open his mind. And he sees all the stuff that's familiar, and then suddenly he finds this text. It's only a couple of pages long. And he realizes he stumbled on a text with the name the Didache, the teaching of the 12 apostles. And he realizes this is the same text that is referred to by Greek scholars 1700 years earlier, such as Didymus the Blind. And when he reads it, he realizes that the structures within the document are so simple, indeed primitive in the good, that this must be a terribly early. So you can see how he's using this new German method. Students sometimes say, oh, I find the German method so cold and so analytical. And you say to them, do you like watching detective stories? Oh, yeah, I love detective stories. Well, the, the Sherlock Holmes method is a sort of a parody of the historical method of 19th century German scholarship.
And what? So he discovers the Didache within this manuscript. What does he do next?
He begins by telling a few people, so the word begins to trickle out, but also being a very formidable young scholar, he realizes that this is going to make his name, as indeed it has. So he worked, and for the next, it took him 10 years. You know, you know, he's the classic scholar who can only give half. A lot of his time is taken up with church work, running the library, all the other things, and then he does this in almost in his spare time. And
But even so, 10 years is a long time for such a
it
short work.
it is. But that's how I I would imagine that part of the reason is the Didache is now read by every student of the early church. But if you were the first person to read this, it was mind-blowing stuff. And he must have taken a long time just for it to sink into him, to realize just how important what he had found is. And it then bursts onto the scene in the 1880s, and within a year is translated into English, is translated into German, is translated into French, and the story of the Didache then goes off and becomes the story that we're still telling today.
What is the initial reception?
The initial reception is the complete spectrum. On one hand, suddenly people are saying, we now have a text that is earlier than the New Testament. And because it's earlier than the New Testament, we can actually use it to create the working environment of the early churches. That, for instance, is the approach taken in many university studies. Many groups find this whole thing terrifying, and it seems to undermine, for some groups, the authority of the scriptures. In other words, the New Testament must be the first thing, therefore, this must be ancillary to it. Another is church groups. Some of them say, here is something without the structures that we have said is absolutely essential. So, for instance, Roman Catholic groups saw it without any reference to a priest, and they saw what they reckoned must be a Eucharist, but without any reference to the Last Supper. So they immediately said, this must be a later, problematic document. And so, for instance, they invented a theory that there was a Eucharist and there was a community meal. There was no evidence for such a distinction. That's purely thought up to try and isolate the evidence of the Didache. Another is to say it recommends fasting, but it had been part of the myth of the early churches, some of the Protestant churches, that fasting was a work, and Jesus was grace, not works. Therefore, Jesus was anti-fasting. Therefore, if this group were fasting, they can't be ordinary Christians. So this must be a heretical group. And so you get groups that in the 19th and 20th centuries are actually fighting with one another, but they come together to agree that the Didache was a forgery of the 4th century. So it really, as the phrase goes, it really threw the cat among the bitch. The what is it? What's that phrase? Threw the
cat among the pigeons.
Cat among the pigeons.
Okay. So you've referred to the Didache as being a very early document, in spite of what some people thought when it first came out. Why do we think the Didache is such an early document? And maybe we could say something about the geography of the Didache, the location of the community to whom it was written, or for whom it was written.
First of all, there's been a long debate going on since 1 year after Bryennios's text. The French decided it had to be in Syria because it makes a reference to a mountain. And a lot of German scholars said, no, it must be in Egypt because that would fit with Jewish groups such as the group known as the Therapeutae. Now, both of those ideas are totally correct. And the reason they're correct is this. Once we had a Greek text of the Didache, we could find echoes of the Didache in Syriac, in Latin, Coptic, and we found other fragments. Once you know what a text looks like, you can find the echoes. Number two, the mountain that is referred to, Israel was scattered on the mountains and now will be regathered by Jesus. The mountain referred to is not in Egypt or anywhere else. It's a mountain out of one of the prophets, because it's a reference to a prophecy of the regathering of Israel. And the very fact that the Didache is so early in Greek and shows that here is a document that was circulating on the early Christian network of books. And if you want to see the way the early Christian network of books worked, what's sometimes called by scholars the Holy Internet, it's the way that the same books are found, not just in one place or another, but right across the early Christian world. And that's what actually generates the collection known as the New Testament. What happens with the Didache is that as the churches became more organized, and all human structures develop organization, it became ever more too simple and out of date. So you can look on the Didache as a very early glimpse of what's happening in churches. Was it happening everywhere? We don't know. Was it happening in some places? Certainly. But it's also the beginnings of the organization. And that organization will get more and more elaborate. And as it got more elaborate, and particularly as it developed an administrative structure of bishops, assisted by presbyters, assisted by deacons, which is a second century development, then something like the Didache is just left behind. It reminds me of we were all, when the first computers came out, we used to get big handbooks on how to use them. And we thought these were the greatest thing ever because they taught you how to underline a sentence. Where would you even find these in an office today? They've long since been put in the recycling. And yet the simplest little book that was bought, because it was content rather than mechanism, that has survived.
So the Didache means teaching.
Yeah.
And should we think of it as a manual for churches or something like that?
Well, you see, we use the word teaching, which is a very posh word, and you think immediately of someone standing at the head of a classroom with a piece of chalk. Uh, think of it as it also the word Didache also means the training, and in it and also and it has in Greek a flavor of the training which is experience. So it's better to think of it as what not a church, but what an individual follower of Jesus needs to make another person a follower of Jesus. So and you do that by apprenticeship. If you think about it, if you think about the way that I've often watched the way carpenters train young carpenters, and they don't give them a big head, but he knows all the things. He shows, and if you imagine the Didache as what you as a Christian need to have learned off so that you can train the next person, then you suddenly realize that the series of do's and don'ts, which is a standard piece of Jewish training practice at the time, uh, you train people to learn off a series of do's and don'ts. You train them to learn off basic things about how to, how to how to make yet another apprentice, which is baptism. You train them in the most basic structure of prayer over the day, which is the Lord's Prayer 3 times a day, and you train them in the basic words of the community ritual, which is a table ritual of thanksgiving, the Eucharist, which would, in the second century, be called the Eucharist. But at the time of the Didache, it's just Be ye thankful, be ye Eucharistic in this way.
Okay, so it's a training in
Yeah.
how to follow a Christian way of life.
I actually think of it in terms of, do you know these Duffer's guides that you discover? Um, I remember going to the photocopier once in Nottingham, and I lifted the lid, and someone had simplified all the rules for the copies into one little yellow sticker. It was the most valuable thing on that photocopier. If you want to do this, do this. Think of the Didache as not the Didache is here. This is it. This is it's boiled down to this. So if you think of training manuals sounds so wonderful, and church order sounds terribly wonderful, which is a phrase invented by Philip Schaff, who was one of the translators into English in the 1880s. And it sounds wonderful. And then it sounds even more wonderful in German. But it really is a very simple document.
And maybe we should get to some of the text itself in more detail. So
Yeah.
it starts with introducing the two ways. It's the most famous part of the Didache. And you have on the one hand the way of life, and on the other the way of death. Where is this structure taken from?
The two ways is a very standard way of introducing Judaism for at least a century before the time of Jesus. And the imagery is taken from the very end of the book of Deuteronomy, which they see as the very last words of Moses. So remember how we see the book of Deuteronomy, and a Jewish community in 100 years either side of Jesus saw the book of Deuteronomy are two very different things. But the impact of the final imagery of Deuteronomy is central through the way all the rabbis, so far as we can see, were presenting Judaism at the time, and Jesus is one of them. And at the end of the book of Deuteronomy, Moses is up on the hill. He's looking into the promised land. He knows he's going to die. He knows he's not going to make it into the promised land. And he says to all the people, I hold out two ways. On the one hand, life, and on the other, you go this way, you will be okay. You go this way, you will perish. And so that's the great image. So the Didache opens with one person who was already a disciple offering the apprentice this great choice. And then the question always becomes, well, what does it mean? So you get a series of do's and you get a series of don'ts.
Before we get into the do's and the don'ts, can I ask whether the audience would be expected to be familiar with Deuteronomy? Is it a Jewish context?
They, this is, if you, we don't, everyone knew that's, whether they'd ever read the book of Deuteronomy is probably, we don't know. Certainly, if you had grown up in a Jewish household, you would have heard that story read in the synagogue. But even if you'd gone to the synagogue and had never heard it, this would have been one of the great images. I'll give you an example. Everyone who grows up on this island, the island of Britain, they have an image of Sir Walter Raleigh playing bowls before going out to the Armada. They don't know where they've read that. They don't know where they've heard it. But everyone knows the story. Have you finished your game of bowls? Everyone knew the great image of Moses up on the mountain looking in. It's one of the great dramatic scenes. So everyone would have known that. So if they'd heard the phrase two way, there are two ways, immediately the imagery of Moses up on top of the mountain looking in, it would have jumped straight into their heads.
They were, and it would have jumped into their heads because they are coming from a Jewish background.
Yes, it's one of the great
The
stories
audience.
that you tell. Just still today, most Christians know basically the Adam and Eve story. There are very few Old Testament stories that you can still take today that you just assume everyone knows. Probably the Adam and Eve story is the only one, indeed. But if you went to anyone who was a follower, anyone who was a Jew, who then became a follower of Jesus, or who had not been a Jew but had become a follower of Jesus, they would have heard this great story of the lawgiver, Moses. Remember, Jesus is presented in Matthew's gospel as a new Moses. So you have to know the basic imagery of the original Moses. Everyone knew this, right? This is the final act.
Can I ask you about the moral teaching, the way of life
Yeah.
in more detail, where that comes from and what that contains?
It is very standard rabbinic teaching on how to be a good person. So, for instance, just as we get the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, we find that in rabbinic in the teaching of many rabbis. We find it in the teaching in the Gospels attributed to Jesus. So we find it in the Didache. The Didache presents in a matter of just less than a page. It presents very similar teaching to what we find in Matthew's Sermon on the Mount. It's a little bit more snappy than Matthew's Sermon on the Mount, but you can look at you. The way I think of it is this: everyone knew the basic moral teaching, and then a great teacher comes into the community like Matthew, and he can give you a very elegant narrative, art, which is what you get in the Sermon on the Mount. Think of the Didache as the kernel, the Sermon on the Mount as the big, the bigger fleshed out story.
Is this why the Didache doesn't directly attribute these things to Jesus, or is there another reason for that?
It's not. Remember, the Didache is not a storyline. Gospels are storylines. The whole idea of a gospel is you're sitting in a group listening to a story by a storyteller. This is just the bare bones standing on their own. And that applies to everything. Like you've asked me about moral teaching. You get bare bones in the Didache. You get a big, lovely story, and it's all detailed in Matthew. You just know this is how you baptize. In Romans chapter 6, you get Paul going off into wonderful theological insights as to what it means. 1/4 of John's Gospel is dedicated to the final meal. You just get bang, bang, bang rules in the Didache. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, you get the great scene of the Last Supper. Here, you just get, this is how you do it. So, if you want narrative, you don't go near the Didache. The Didache is not for sitting around it's not, you don't sit around to read the Didache and think, gosh, isn't that a great story? You just say, okay, that's what we do. Is that right? Okay, that's okay. Like, we do it that way. The exception to that is the final chapter. And we're not sure whether the final chapter of the Didache, it has such a different style, it originally belonged to that document, or whether it's another little, it circulated as a sermon, and then at some stage just got latched on.
This is the apocalyptic part at the end. Okay. Well,
Changes from rules to it suddenly changes from here's how you do it to a prophecy.
discuss that certainly in more detail. So we've described the way of life and the derivation of those rules from the Ten Commandments, from the Sermon on the Mount, um, and that's far longer than the way of death that's described. But what is the way of death as per the Didache?
The way of death is a list of things that you must not do. Like some of them you'll immediately do not commit adultery. But some of them are actually very interesting. Like, for instance, don't go and get poisons for spells. Don't go off and getting poison. You see, we we we, we would say, oh, well, that is no. Um, and yet, in a world where people put curses on one another, in a world uh, where people believe that spells work, well, putting a spell on someone that is that is not part of the Christian way. Um, Famously, Clement Attlee said, someone asked Clement Attlee what he thought of Christianity, and he said, "Oh, I like the morality, but not the mumbo jumbo." We make a great distinction between the ethical part of the Didache and for instance, the part on prayer. But remember, that is not a distinction that belonged to the people who memorized the Didache, because uh, stealing is wrong for the Didache, but probably people thought that putting a spell on someone which could damage them was a far more serious thing. And yet we don't even understand that. Um, we think of fasting in, we're not sure whether we think of fasting a, as a good thing or a bad thing, or whether it's just slimming. But for the Didache, fasting showed that you were going to, you had got the instruction, you knew how to behave as one of the gang. It really was being able to march with all the other fellows down the, the drill square. So we have to realize that the Didache shows us a different way of thinking about ourselves as individuals within a community. For instance, the Didache assumes that it's not I who am on I am not on the way of life. We're on the way of life, and I'm actually one of you because I do all the right things.
You write very insightfully, or I found it very insightful, about boundary markers and how important they were to creating and maintaining a sense of community and ensuring the right behavior of everyone within it. And so we've already picked up on one of those big ones, which is fasting. Could we expand on the role of fasting within the community?
Judaism in the first century is made up of many different flavors. Famously, Josephus tells us that there were three great groups. There were the Essenes, there were the Pharisees, and there were the Sadducees. And he tells us how he experimented with all three groups. Well, that's Josephus being his usual neat self. There were umpteen different groups. And the way the groups identified themselves was by having boundary markers which separated. So, for instance, uh, Tuesdays and Thursdays were, in many groups, were the fasting days. The followers of Jesus moved the day to Wednesdays and Fridays. So they're clearly part of the same larger movement in that they have fasting days, but they're doing it a different way. Baptism, the idea that you go through a boundary move that says, I'm now part of your group. I think when I'm teaching, I say, look, think of this in terms of graduation. You're now graduated. So many groups were using washing as the boundary marker. The most famous example we have of that is that we know John. John was doing it when he became known as John the Baptizer. So the followers of Jesus take over a washing, but they give it a different significance. This is going to be washing, establishing a relationship with the Father, establishing a relationship with Jesus, and in the Didache, you already see that even more developed, baptized in the name of the Father, Son, and Spirit. So you can see that the Didache itself isn't the product of a single moment. It was a document that was evolving over the years of its use. But if you're going to have a sense of a community, you have to have ways by which people actually experience the distinction of being part of the community. Now, that's not something that we're big into, but just imagine, go back even 100 years, uh, everyone who had got uniform. So, distinctive clothing is a boundary bar. Now, that certainly was rejected by the early followers of Jesus, but we do know we know that Jewish groups used clothing, have have community rituals, and if the rituals are the same over in different places, the people in different places will feel that they have actually got peace with one another. And then probably the best boundary marker you can have is a shared sense of time. Judaism had an incredibly organized sense of time. There was the Sabbath, a weekly, a weekly community shared time. Then there were all the different festivals over the year: Pesach, Pentecost, Hanukkah. That, and then there was even larger sense of time in that the idea were the fallow year. So the followers of Jesus take over this, and it becomes Easter, and a shared sense of time becomes one of the ways you both link up with and also distinguish yourself. A good example is just look at the Christian churches today. One of the things that keeps them apart is that they often have different colors.
some aspects of the baptism are very familiar. You say baptizing in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Ghost. One part that people often know about if they don't know very much about the Didache, and that is different from the practices of many Christians today, is the emphasis on living water being the ideal kind of water in which to baptize people.
Yeah. Well, the curious thing is that there were clearly debates in the early communities about how you baptized. Did you have to use a river? Could you use just ordinary water? Could you use seawater and whatever? There were clearly debates on it. And the interesting thing is that there were probably different practices in different places. Uh, if you're living on a Mediterranean island, a baptism in the sea is a very simple thing to do. The great waters. If you're living near a river, that's very easy. But if you're living somewhere where either of these, and what the Didache actually says is, it doesn't matter whether it's this or that. It actually is trying to take different practices and align. So that's one of the ways we see that the Didache is not a single moment, someone sitting down and writing, here is the instruction manual. Here's an instruction manual that has been edited, re-edited, added in. And so the practice of one group, the practice of another group, and they've been glued together. And we have other examples of that in early Christian writings. Everyone knows the story of the Last Supper. Right? At the beginning of the supper, he took a loaf of bread, and then when supper was ended, he took a cup of wine. Okay, that's the basic story. We all know. Now, you actually read Luke's gospel, and he has a cup of wine and a loaf of bread and another cup. And I have actually read this and said to people, how many cups? Well, there's only one cup, because the story is stronger than what they're reading in the text. But when you read the text, it's cup, loaf, cup. Now, it's actually happened there, and you can see where the stellotaping is taking place. In some churches, they had the cup followed by the loaf. In another church, the loaf followed by the cup, what later becomes under, and the two are joined together in our version, Luke's Gospel. Now, the same thing has happened in the Didache. There's some who are saying, oh, it's got to be this type of water. Others saying it's got to be the Didache says he can use either.
So it's ensuring that it fits the need of different communities in different places
And
with different practices.
and there's probably in both of those examples the need the need to make sure that groups cannot remember. Every group has a tendency to join with others, but also a tendency to go off on its own. And in both Luke's Gospel and the Didache, there's a definite agenda to try and stop people splitting off, to stop the split off tendency. Oh, I don't think you're doing that the right way. Okay. Do you know the great image from the life of Brian, where the guys are setting up Palestine? If you know the famous group of revolutionaries, and in the end they do nothing because they all decide to give themselves different names.
Yes, I do.
That great scene, there's an element in the Didache saying, stop finding all the differences, find the commonalities.
So you spoke about the Eucharist as is that so the order of bread and wine is reversed to what we're used to today. So
In some places, it was what we're used to. In other places, it was the reverse. In some places, they used a loaf of bread and a cup of wine. In some places, they used a loaf of bread and a cup of water.
but in the Didache it's reverse. So the order
In
we're familiar
the
with today.
Didache, yes, and that was one of the reasons that in the Didache is the only ex- explicit positive evidence that there were communities using cup followed by loaf. There is some implicit evidence in the first letter to the Corinthians where Paul at one point talks about loaf followed by cup, but then talks about cup followed by loaf. But it's implicit. So here's an example of, of how the Didache has helped scholarship. Everyone knew there was a problem with Luke's gospel. How could that have happened? How come there's cup, loaf, cup? And in fact, in around the year 300, a great Greek bishop, Eusebius of Caesarea, better known for his church history, he had actually tried to solve this problem. And down the centuries, people had come up with solution after solution. And only 20 years before the Didache was found, a very famous solution had been produced by a scholar in Oxford, which you still find wandering around in many textbooks. But once we had actually found the Didache, we could now see, now we have evidence for one practice and evidence for the other practice. Now we can suddenly see what was happening in the text of Luke. So people say, oh, the Didache, it's full of problems. Yeah, it is full of problems. But it's equally important to remember it solved an awful lot of other problems as well.
So some of the problems are with the Eucharist, not just the order bread or wine or wine and bread, but where baptism looks fairly familiar to us, the Eucharist looks very different from, for example, Roman Catholic practices.
Oh yes, the reason for that is that, and that's why the Didache is so. That's one of the reasons that the Didache has to be a very early document because it's still focusing on a real community meal. It hasn't yet become the token community meal which emerges in possibly the late second or early third century. And once the meal becomes a completely ritualized event, it then has to develop a ritual logic of its own. And it's that ritual logic that you would see, for instance, takes one form in the Greek celebration of the Eucharist and takes another form in the Roman Catholic celebration of the Eucharist. But at the time of the Didache, you're actually talking about a real community meal. And the question then the Didache poses to us is, number one, when did the actual meal disappear to be replaced by a token meal? And can we speculate as to why the real meal disappeared? And the answer is to both those questions, we can only, we, number one, we can't be definite. But for instance, we know that from a document from the 160s, from Rome, but by a man called Justin, that there was still a meal there. There was still a real meal there. But the next time we get evidence from the West, it's become a token meal. And so it's, and then why did that happen? Well, that's another area where, we have to, we can see, we only see little shadows of the evidence, and then we have to try and speculate as to why. Why did a real meal disappear it and become tokenized?
Is it so? Is it not in a large part that the communities grew, and so having a real meal altogether became impractical?
Probably that's part of the case. Also, the communities grew and meals cost money. And people said, "Oh, well, I'm now a Christian. Yeah, I got that, but but it's also probably that we know that the meal was a very awkward socially. The Roman Empire, the whole of the Mediterranean world, the Greco-Roman world, is a world of hierarchies. Um, you are you 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 know your place in society, but you're also a client of someone. You depend on someone more important than you, and the more important person then relies on having people who are dependent on them. On if you're One of the ways you maintain hierarchies in Greco-Roman society is with meal practice. Do you actually sit on the three reclining couches in the triclinium, the great dining room, or do you? And this is the word that's used in is used of by Pliny to describe the Christian. You just munch your food. So there's definitely an element in which it's one thing to say we're all Christian and God loves us all and all the rest of it. We're all made in the image of God. It's another thing to actually share food with your servants. And we already see that in 1 Corinthians. Paul is saying, don't insult the poor. We better have no meal, says the article. Better have no meal than to do it in an insulting way to them. And it's probably the case that as Christianity becomes far less radical within society, people say, I'm a Christian, but I'm also such within society. I belong to the Decurion, it's the bottom civil level, civil, the civil service. In which case, you don't want to eat with people who don't belong, and you certainly don't. So, how then how do you keep the rule? Eat ye this, but no way I'm going to eat servants. Well, make it into a token. And there is some evidence from Egypt that shows that actually uh, in the Oxyrhynchi papyri, uh, they of people saying, come to my house for breakfast. after the Eucharist. And in other words, we'll have our token meal, and
A real meal subsequently.
yeah,
And we've already alluded to this, but is the meal described in the Didache definitely not a love feast? Is it definitely
the
the
love
Eucharist?
the love feast is um, there's a beautiful description by the professor in Yale of the love feast was invented in the late 19th century to try and get round the awkwardness of the Didache. No, when Christians when Christians eat and they thank God, it's the Eucharist. It's it's only if you've already decided that the later practice must be perfect and therefore must be there all the time, which is the very opposite of the historical method, then you have to invent a love feast. And of course, it sounds much better if you then give the love feast a Greek name, the agape. That sounds even better because it sounds as if you've discovered it in the documents. No, that's I'm I'm uh, I'm I'm trying to. There's a beautiful line in a scholar from Yale where he says, this is the last. It's the equivalent of this is the last refuge of a scoundrel who doesn't want to have to face the awkward questions that the Didache poses to us.
What would you say as a priest in the Roman Catholic Church to those who say this simply can't be the Eucharist because you don't have a priest or a presbyter presiding over the host?
Well, what I would say is just that's just historical anachronism. All human ritual is always evolving. It tends to become ever more elaborate and ever more full of must be, must not be type rules. But human ritual also brings with it an imagination that it's always been thus. You do something new this year, you repeat it next year because repeating is easy. And by the third year, everyone is convinced this is tradition since time immemorial. And what I would say is just look at all the changes that have taken place. And it's only when you look through all the changes that you see there are certain elements that are valuable and there are certain elements that come in. And of course, once something comes in, it tends to be galvanized. So uh, look at the Didache, take a deep breath and say, gosh, there's an awful lot of stuff that we might just have to put a little question mark over. By the way, that's not true just for RCs. That will be true of all the different churches, because some of them would say having a meal together is not very important.
Yeah.
The Greeks would do it a different way. So when you look at an early document that is apparently so different, it's a little bit like having a having a having a hot cup of coffee that makes you wake up.
Yes. And obviously, and you talk really well in your book about why looking back to the early church is particularly important to Christians, as Christianity is such an explicitly historical religion. So people are either claiming to have carried all the way through to today the practices and the beliefs of the earliest followers of Jesus, or often are claiming to be returning to those practices and beliefs.
Yeah. Yes, Christianity is a very Christianity is unusual in this sense that all it's teaching is about the future. And yet, when it wants to look and understand its teaching, it always looks backwards. But if you already think you know everything about looking backwards, well, the Didache will give you a very convenient early surprise.
So I'd like to ask about the leadership of these early Christian communities. So we sort of already referred to the lack of a presbyter at the Eucharist, but what kind of leadership structure are we looking at here?
The answer is that we don't, the simple answer is we don't know. And what little insights we can get from the beginnings and endings of Paul's letters and from looking at incidental remarks in other documents and from looking at incidental remarks in the Didache, we can't be sure that any of the structures were universal. So, for instance, we know that in some places the leaders were called presbyters, elders. Was there one or was there a group of them? Probably in some places there was a single elder, in other places there was a little group. In some places they were called deacons. Again, individual, a deacon, the servant of the community, or a group. We don't know. Some places they were called the overseer. Again, single, one overseer, episkopos, a bishop, or was there a group of episcopoi, because they're referred to in the plural, overseers? It could be in some places that they were called episcopoi kai diaconoi, the overseers and servants, in other words, the servant overseers. Uh, in other places, we know there was a character called the Huperites. Is that a librarian, or is it the secretary of the association? Or is it, we know that there were teachers, we know there were apostles. Apostles were not the followers of Jesus originally, but the ones sent from one church to another church. So they were part of the linking up structure. Then there's people called evangelistoi, uh, evangelists. Okay, we know the names, all of them, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But we know there were many others. We haven't left a name, we haven't left texts. So the answer, and I know you'd love me to say it was like this, and maybe I could get a mark up a little structure up on the board, an organogram. The answer is the moment you see an organogram before the end of the 2nd century, put a big question mark over it.
The Didache so talks quite a lot as well about itinerant preachers or prophets or apostles, and they're obviously held in well, they're both held in high regard, but they're also an object of potential issues for the community. And the Didache talks about some of the problems that might emerge and how to try to circumnavigate those issues.
Underlying an awful lot of early Christian documents is the twin need to try and make communities link up with one another and also to stop splintering. Perhaps the most extreme example of that is the Acts of the Apostles, where Luke has Paul wandering around making sure that everyone has a common origin in Paul in the area of Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, and the Aegean Sea. In the Didache, it's clear that one of the problems that's leading to greater structures is the fact that there were charlatans around. In fact, everyone knows the word Christian or Christ bearer, but the Didache is another word which is Christ hawker. In other words, people who know that if this is a community who welcomes people and will give them some food in exchange for some teaching, that they can take this, they could they could turn this into a meal ticket. So it's an issue in the community, and it's one of the issues that will later lead not only to very formal church structures that we see when we get to the end of the second century and we have bishops and presbyters and deacons, and they're all in a nice structure. But actually, the fact that they will build up structures between churches that will regulate things. But there's one of the interesting things about the Didache is we often think early churches in very rose romantic terms. But just remember, it's all the problems that generate many of the writings of Paul, most famously one, but that would be true of other writings of, for instance, some of the letters that are glued together in 2 Corinthians, but also the most developed part of the Didache is when it actually has to have what one scholar has called protective wisdom. A small community can be incredibly charitable, but it mustn't be taken for a ride. And that may be actually the spring that would generate a very elaborate structure we see from the end of the second century onwards.
No, it's very interesting in the Didache itself to see the attempt to avoid issues. So it says with the wandering preachers, don't let them stay for, is it more than
Yeah,
a day or 2 days at the most,
yeah,
unless they want to settle and work within the community for a living. But there are also practices that seem open to problems that haven't yet manifested and so haven't been dealt with in the Didache. And so one example of that is the practice of public confession.
it's just not an issue until much later on. Um, it's only later on that you start getting all the problems of how do you. It's one thing to organize a group which is effectively standing to us outside society, but what do you do when the group becomes almost coextensive with the society? Because now suddenly you have to deal with the problems of the society. And then at times of persecution, what do you do with the people who just take to the hills and flee? Do you let them back in? So all of these issues, they're still way over the horizon. Um, just as they're not on the horizon of any of our documents from the first 2 centuries. Because whenever a religious group becomes identified with the society, or the society becomes identified with the religious group, the religion carries many of the problems of the society and actually has to serve that society. The best example of that is the fact that you find no reference at all to Christian marriage in any of the early documents. Oh, the only reference is Jesus goes to the wedding feast at Cana, but there's nothing on it because the society regulated marriage, and the society regulated marriage effectively with regard to inheritance of money and titles. Is your son going to be a citizen of the Roman Empire? is your daughter going to inherit such and such? But it's only later, and suddenly the Christianity and the society, they start to overlap with that. Suddenly the people who are thinking in terms of society, they just keep going. Now suddenly the people who are thinking in terms of the church and the religion, they have to now deal with these issues.
Before we finish up, we skipped over the place of prayer in the Didache and the Lord's Prayer too, because one of the things that is very striking reading the Didache for the first time is that the Lord's Prayer is so similar to the version we use today, and for Protestants, it even has the doxology at the end.
The interesting thing is that the Lord's Prayer is preserved in two ways. It's preserved by oral transmission, and it's also preserved as part of the text of Matthew's Gospel. Now, a very simple way of noting the difference is to note that everyone today says, Our Father who art in heaven. Heaven, singular. In Matthew's Gospel, it says, Our Father who art in the heavens, in the heavens. Now, there is an example of how the literary tradition conforms to the literary tradition of Greek, but the oral tradition conforms to an older pattern that links with the Old Testament. In the Didache, we actually have a written form of the oral tradition. Our Father who art in the heaven, singular. With regard to the long form, for thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, well, that's the obvious rounding off. And what happened for many Western Christians was that got chopped off in the way they used it in the Eucharist. And so they got used to saying the short. And that's why Roman Catholics still say, and deliver us from evil, amen. Because the other bit had been moved a couple of minutes later and they forgot that that was part of it. So we have the Didache is actually a monument to the oral form, which goes all the way back. Because if it were just a literary form, it would have followed, and among other things, that example I gave you, in the heavens. The most important thing, though, to remember is that for the Didache, it's a prayer that's linked to the sanctification of the day. The Jewish day, beginning in the evening, there's prayer in the evening, prayer in the morning. That's the basic unit of ritual time. And for Christians, the day was the basic unit of ritual time. And it's quite possible that the communities of Christians, they just gathered times a day for that and said the Lord's Prayer. Because we have examples of it from Judaism, the idealized picture confirmed in the book of Judith, and we have examples of that from later practice in Syria.
I think that is reason enough. But if you were tasked with advertising the Didache to ordinary Christians for giving a short explanation for why they would benefit from engaging with it, what would you say?
Well, I would say it gives you a base. My own, and is that the Didache shows that remembering God at dawn, at sunset, and midday is the very basis of everything that you do in terms of prayer. So I would just take that. It's avoid long prayers, said Jesus, avoid many words. Here is a very simple summary of the whole relationship of Israel to God. Um, and if people adopt, if every disciple adopted just that lump out of the Didache, I think we would have an amazing pattern of discipleship.
I think that's a good place to end. I would encourage anyone who has enjoyed listening to this podcast to go and read Tom's book, Didache, A Window on the Earliest Christians, which is an introduction in more detail than we've been able to get into today, and translation of the Didache. And I would encourage you, if you like this content, to sign up for the Faithwave app and see what's on there, because there's much more like this. Professor Tom O'Loughlin, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.